Utah homeowners, all the electric companies like Rocky Mountain.
Yep, Derick. Yep.
All right, so I did not come into this debate with a positivistic contention. And in fact, I wanted to first grant a few premises not normally granted to people debating MMT. One, that it's fundamental presumption that currency cannot be, how would you say, you can't run out of it if you have how MMT defines currency sovereignty is absolutely true. The issues that we're going to be discussing and its implications are why that is and what the implications of that are, and some of the deeper implications of the history of MMT as a theory. Its relationship to chartalism, its differences from classical chartalism, its relationship to Marxism, its differences and similarities to Marxism, and what we even mean, I think, is going to come up by post-capitalism, as it is a very under-limited term. It's probably going to be a point of contention as well. I will also grant that I think MMT specifically and post-Keynesianism in general are probably the most fruitful areas for even people economically inclined outside of their sphere to engage with, because I can tell you that engaging with both, I would almost call it proto-MMT, there's slight differences of like post-Keynesianists such as Marvin Minsky and Stephen King, and also with MMTers, has really pushed my understanding of modern economics in ways that debating axioms with Austrians and neoclassicals is not. However, I do think there are troubling implications in some of MMT's underlying assumptions because of the almost totalizing focus on currency and circuit currency. And I think that is where Sam and I are going to primarily disagree. Yeah, I am a writer and mostly actually a poet. I am not a professional economist. Uh-oh. Yeah. I am not a professional economist, and I want to admit that out the board. I have done research into economics and the history of economics going on for 10 years now. I have been in debates with people adjacent to discussions. I would say oppositional discussions more than debates with people adjacent to MMT for about a decade. And I find that it's something we have to deal with if we're going to be talking about modern economics. That's good. It's hard to have a debate if your opponent has been eaten by the void.
Nobody heard any of that. But I think it's working out. Jack, can you tell me if you can hear me now? Somebody answer.
So do we need to rerun all the introductions? Okay, that's fine.
Looks all weird for the video. Screwed up my. Will be fixed as soon as he comes back.
Yep.
There we go. Jesus.
Temporary Wi-Fi malfunction. Sorry, had to switch to a different network.
Go through everything again because my video wasn't working. Okay, so
Okay.
we are for a future. I'm here with Sam Kangarloo. Oh, Varn of books. Q&A. So Derick, why don't you go ahead and start your intro again? Sorry about that.
All right. Hi, I'm C. Derick Varn. I am an editor and author at Zero Books. And my specialties are actually more economic history than economics proper. Although my academic background is more in anthropology and in English and instruction. So, we're eclectic here. I am not a professional economist, do not claim to be a professional economist, and I want that known to be out on the outset. I want to admit some limitations in this. However, I also want to grant that we are not going to be debating what we would consider the central claim of MMT, which is that currency is in neoclassical axioms for a long time, and even more studiously avoided by Austrian ones. So I think that one of the reasons I agreed to do this debate was because I think that we have to deal with all the implications of MMT, particularly when we talk about something as nebulous as a post-capitalist society. I suspect that Sam and I disagree on what post-capitalism actually is. We might even disagree about what capitalism is. But we need to tease these out in a mildly oppositional manner, I think. And I want to encourage everybody, regardless of who you side with today, to really dig into and try to deal with the questions MMT raises, because it is important.
All right, I'm Sam Kangarloo. My academic background is also very multidisciplinary, like Derick's, mostly in the social sciences, history, sociology, government, and philosophy, and finding synthesis between them. I'm a subject matter expert on modern monetary theory, who corresponds with a number of MMT economists, and with whom I have relationships where I pose challenges, questions, and where we workshop various ideas connected to MMT. In particular, I've kept up a semi-regular correspondence with MMT pioneer Warren Mosler. And very recently, I've actually turned Dr. Cornel West onto MMT. I'm also involved with several MMT advocacy groups and organizations, including the organization Real Progressives, run by its founder, Stephen Grumbine. I engage with parliamentary politics as a progressive, and in that capacity, I've worked to support and advocate and volunteer for progressive political campaigns here in the United States, most recently for the Bernie Sanders presidential campaign, and prior to that for a number of proto-Bernie presidential campaigns in various capacities, including policy advocacy. That's included the Dennis Kucinich for president campaign and twice for Ralph Nader. Now, that being said, the underlying political philosophy or ideology to which I subscribe is libertarian socialism, which, as many in your audience will know, is just a polite term for anarchism, right? So my advocacy for progressive politics, the anarchist principles to which I adhere, and my understanding of MMT form a synthesis that I think offers a cohesive and pragmatically and practically actionable way to alleviate as much suffering as possible, as quickly as possible, under our world's current socioeconomic reality, while simultaneously moving us toward a post-capitalist world, before humanity finds itself in a situation where ecological and socioeconomic breakdown reach a point of no return. The most immediate source of that threat, I think, is clearly neoliberal capitalism and the austerity policies which it advances and supports. Austerity policies that are not only entirely economically unnecessary, but that, and this cannot be overstated, directly and indirectly, more than any other cause, lead to more worldwide death and destruction, all of which are unnecessary, and have led to the rise of folks like Donald Trump throughout the world. Thank you. Great. Okay, so the first and foremost, what people need to understand and is often misunderstood about MMT is it's not something that is done. Okay, it's not something you do. It's not something a government does. It is a thoroughly empirical project. Therefore, it is descriptive, not prescriptive. That makes it something that can be grafted onto literally any number of political ideologies and orientations, from liberalism to conservatism, progressivism to Trumpism, fascism to socialism, any other one you can think of. And just to quote preeminent MMT scholar and economist Bill Mitchell, quote, MMT is not a regime that you apply or switch to or introduce. Rather, MMT is a lens which allows us to see the true intrinsic workings of the fiat monetary system. It helps us better understand the choices available to a currency issuing government. It is not a regime, but an accurate perspective on reality. And I completely concur with that. So what are the central insights or revealed truths that MMT demonstrates to be the case? So here I'm just going to give some high-level MMT fundamentals, and then over the course of the debate and discussion, I'll go into greater detail on these fundamentals as needed as they come up, right? So first and foremost, as Derick alluded to, is the idea that money is a creature of the state or some other issuing authority, okay? Money was not born of barter, nor does it represent barter, as we've all been raised to think, and that so many economists get wrong. Even Karl Marx got that one wrong. The barter story of money is a myth. And this realization about what money actually is and how it functions is known, as Derick said, as chartalism. And it's been corroborated by anthropologists the world over long before MMT ever came to fruition back in 1996. The most notable anthropologist to corroborate this MMT claim is probably the very recently deceased David Graeber, who was an anarchist and who in his book, Debt, the First 5,000 Years, proves exactly this claim about the origins of money and what it is and how it functions. But as I said, he's not the first or the only anthropologist to prove this. So what is money then? Okay, three central things here. It is a social unit of account. It is a promise to pay, therefore it's an IOU. And the third, it's a tax credit, which I realize is not self-explanatory, but again, that's one that we can flesh out as it comes up, if it comes up during the debate. Second fundamental insight, and Derick alluded to this as well, a country that is fully monetarily sovereign does not finance federal spending with tax dollars. And this cannot be emphasized enough by MMT. What that means is that the government does not actually tax in order to spend, nor does it actually borrow in order to spend, meaning bonds do not function to finance government spending. Monetarily sovereign nations spend money into existence through their federal legislative bodies. That means as issuers of a currency that they have complete control over, they spend first, and when they tax, those tax dollars are actually deleted from the economy. So your federal tax dollars do not pay for any federal spending whatsoever. That includes your payroll taxes, Medicare and Social Security. And that bit was actually well understood by the Roosevelt administration, by FDR's administration when they introduced the Social Security program. And look, I realize that all of that begs a lot of questions, like what about all the money I keep hearing we owe the Chinese? But again, we can cover that in detail and depth during the debate as needed. I do think it's important now to define what the heck a fully monetarily sovereign nation is. And so a fully monetary sovereign nation is one that meets four criteria. Okay, one, it issues its own currency. Two, it taxes in its own currency. Three, it must not be taxing its population in any currency other than its own. And four, it lets its currency float, which simply means that its currency isn't pegged to anything like gold or silver or to the currency of another country. Okay. Examples of countries that are fully monetarily sovereign include the United States, Canada, the UK, Japan, Australia, Sweden, Norway, Switzerland, New Zealand, Iceland, and many others. So for those who may have noticed, I haven't mentioned a single country that's on the euro, and there's a good reason for that, which we can tackle during the debate segment as well. All of that does not, however, mean that the government can just spend without constraint, okay? There is a constraint. It's just not tax dollars, since tax dollars don't actually fund federal spending. The constraint is real resource availability. When the spending in an economy, otherwise known as aggregate demand in econ speak, outstrips the amount of goods and services that are actually being produced, and there aren't enough available resources, meaning land, labor, and machinery, to meet that increased spending, to meet that increased demand, you get inflationary pressure, which can lead to actual inflation. Too much inflation and you get a general rise in prices that can severely hamper the value of people's money as prices rise and the value of the currency falls. And that degrades the ability of people to meet their material needs, okay? That's known as demand pull inflation. There's also cost push inflation and sectoral inflation pressures, but I'm not gonna get into that right now. Again, that's something we can tackle during the back and forth segment. But all of that suggests correctly a number of things, including that inflation is actually really not that easy to generate in an economy that has full monetary sovereignty, okay? And everything I've mentioned in this second insight means that governments do not and should not function like households. You and I have to balance our budget, or we have to borrow. This is not the case for governments, nor should it be, okay? Lest they otherwise create the pressures for an otherwise unnecessary economic crisis. Third fundamental insight, sectoral balances. By virtue of the public sector, therefore the government, spending money into existence, into the economy, the government's yearly budget deficits are the economy's yearly surpluses. And the government's national debt, which by definition is the sum total of all budget deficits and surpluses that government has ever run, the national debt is the national savings of the private sector. So the national debt is not really debt at all. And to quote, pay it off would literally mean that there would be no money in the economy, okay? That's another point that anthropologists, including Graeber, have recognized as a result of research in their own discipline, and it's totally congruent with MMT. The government sector's account balance equals the sum of the non-government sector, namely the private sector and foreign sector, to the penny. So I'm going to make that concrete with this very simple example. The United States has a so-called national debt of roughly $20 trillion, okay? That's $20 trillion the government of the United States has spent into existence since the inception of the country, so since 1786, right? Then when you examine how many dollars are held in the domestic private economy, households and firms, you see that it's roughly 19.83 trillion. The remaining 170 billion is held by foreign entities. That's our trade deficit, okay? The numbers, negative 20 trillion for the federal government, right? That's how much they're quote unquote in debt, and plus 20 trillion for the private and foreign sectors combined, sum to zero. So these are accounting identities, right? In other words, these are nothing more than empirically true accounting identities. It's why when MMTers explain MMT to certified public accountants, those folks tend to get it much quicker than most of the general public. I've heard so many CPAs say to me, oh, yeah, what you're describing are just accounting identities. That's double entry accounting. And that's correct. That's what the central banks of the world use to keep score of their economies. All right. Central banks like the Federal Reserve are literally scorekeepers of the economy. They neither have nor do not have dollars or pounds or yen or what have you. Okay. The money is created out of thin air by legislative decree. And that is what's meant when you hear the term fiat currency. Okay. And the central bank's job in that respect is simply to type those dollars into existence, which, by the way, is how it happens. It's not the printing of money. These days, it's literally the keyboarding of the currency into existence via computers at the central bank for us in the private sector to use. And in the days that preceded information technology, these operations were tracked by paper ledger, okay?
Mhm.
Fourth thing, banking. The common perception is that deposits create loans. That when you make a deposit at a bank, the deposit that you make into your checking account, okay, are then used by that bank for lending. MMT demonstrates that this is not true. Loans actually create deposits. Private banks, like the ones where we all keep our money, right? They create money out of thin air every time they lend, all right? And they too literally keystroke those dollars into existence. In this case, into your checking account, right? You take a loan and the bank deposits those loan dollars into your checking account. That loan created the deposit. So the money multiplier story is not borne out by reality. And it's yet another example of how mainstream economists have tried to fit the available data to their pre-existing models instead of creating models that actually fit the available data, okay? So last fundamental tenet is unemployment. Unemployment is never an economic inevitability, okay? It's never an economic, quote unquote, necessity. It's always a political choice. The government can buy, the central authority of the government can buy as much labor as it wants. And the federal jobs guarantee, which I'm sure many of your audience have heard about, is the only thing intrinsic to MMT that comes close to being prescriptive. And that's because MMT notices that a federal jobs guarantee can simultaneously solve the problem of unemployment while maintaining price stability, therefore avoiding inflation, okay? So it's intrinsic to MMT for those reasons, and because also it's countercyclical, which just means simply that it contracts and expands with the business cycle. And I'm happy to chat more about that later on as well. So to sum up, taking all of that into account, whenever you hear someone, whether it be your uncle or your friend, or especially some lawmaker or policymaker in Washington say, how are you going to pay for that? Whenever single payer healthcare or a Green New Deal or a living wage, a federal jobs guarantee, or even tax cuts, et cetera, depending on your politics, are brought up, the answer should always be, quote, literally the same way we've always been paying for all government spending since FDR took us off the domestic gold standard in 1934. Congress passes legislation, and the Treasury spends the money by instructing the Federal Reserve to mark up the relevant bank accounts. The money is simply always spent into existence. And so long as there are enough goods and services being produced or able to be produced to meet whatever increased demand those new federally injected dollars might generate, we can afford it. Thank you very much.
So I'm going to start with a series of questions, some of which are going to get into some things that I find interesting that is bracketed out of the empirical considerations of MMT. Now, notice that I am not contesting almost anything that Sam says, because he's right. In many ways, they're uncontestable. But I do have a couple of considerations that I want to talk about. When we talk about economic sovereignty, we talk about trade in terms of states. So do you owe states, if the state taxes in another currency, if it owes debts significantly in another currency, that most of the third world, for example, is automatically eradicated from current MMT considerations. We're not talking about possibilities here, because they owe debts in either USD or euros. And we also didn't mention, if somebody noticed in the list of currency sovereigns, we did not mention China, and we can talk about why for a second, but China's currency is not actually free floating. And so it cannot be considered a currency sovereign. There are reasons for that. That some of the considerations of MMT confuses me on how they explain, but we'll get into that later in the debate as well. But I am interested in the fact that private trade and currency sovereignty is not addressed in the definition. Sam, why is that?
Could you explain to me what you mean by private trade?
So trade between firms, so international trade that is demarcated in a currency other than the currency of the nation at hand, between firms internationally.
Yep. So when that happens, that actually is a part of current account balances. That's part of a trade deficit. So when firms, for example, a firm in China and a firm in the United States trade, that gets added into that country's current account balance. The sum difference between exports and imports. So it's taken into account in the sectoral balances explanation I gave. And in the case of the United States, when you have a trade deficit, okay, that money that you spent on real goods and services that you imported had to come from somewhere, right? The Chinese don't have a printing press. They don't have a central bank that keystrokes US dollars into existence, right? So we are giving them that money for real goods and services. Mm-hmm. And that money plus the domestic private economy in the United States combined sum to zero with the US's so-called national debt. And what's important to keep in mind here, and I alluded to, and I'm glad you brought it up, is this fear about like all this money that we owe the Chinese. Here's what happens operationally. It's actually pretty simple. So we have this trade deficit with the Chinese. This money is held at the Federal Reserve Bank in what are called reserve accounts, which is just fancy econ speak for a checking account at the central bank, at the Federal Reserve in the case of the United States, okay? And so what happens is the Chinese would prefer to earn a rate of return, some interest on this money that they have in their reserve account. And so what they do is they ask, or they tell, because it's an option, the Federal Reserve to move that money from their checking account at the Fed to their savings account, which is what's known as a treasury account. So all of these bonds that we owe the Chinese is literally just moving money from one pocket of the Federal Reserve to the other, moving their money from their checking account to their savings account. There's no problem. If the Chinese tomorrow say, we want all our money, we literally keystroke that money back from their savings account, AKA their treasury account, which is also sometimes called a securities account. All three of those terms are synonymous. They're all the same thing. And then back into their reserve or checking account.
Now, why is it in the Chinese interest to do that?
Why is it in their interest to do it? Mm-hmm. Okay. So it's interesting because they're the ones taking all the risk. What we constantly hear, like in the cultural milieu and the socio-political milieu about this is that like, oh my God, we're taking all this risk by having to import all these real goods from China and building up all of this quote, debt, which is not actually, we're just moving it from one hand to the other in their account. It's never an obligation that we can't meet. So who's taking the real risk here? China is trading real goods and services for numbers on a spreadsheet at the Federal Reserve. I don't say that hyperbolically, literally. Now, why would they do that, right? Mm-hmm. Because they want US dollars, right? They want US dollars. The US dollar is the reserve currency of the world, and they want to be able to they're an economy that relies on a trade surplus.
Right. And they rely on a trade surplus. Why?
Well, because they don't have the internal infrastructure to develop everything that they need. They still require a certain degree of, here's the thing, you have a very large population, billions of people, right? Mm-hmm. And you're producing goods and services that not everyone within China as a nation is going to be able to consume, right? And mm-hmm. if they were to produce all of these things and try to sell them within their own markets, it would create deflationary pressure. The rest of the world has created a demand for Chinese goods because of the cost of labor, right? The cost of labor in China is cheap, and so cheap goods and services are exported to the rest of the world, and the Chinese are able to collect US dollars, which is a valuable currency that they can use to build their own infrastructure. And in fact, as you alluded to earlier, the Chinese currency is pegged to the US dollar currently, but they'll be off the US dollar within probably 5 years.
It is becoming increasingly separate. I mean, they have a basket of reserves and commodities that they're tying their currency to, and eventually they will probably tie it to nothing, and it'll be truly fiat. Agreed. So there's a couple of things that I find interesting about that, again, in the bracketing out, and that is the power relationships that led to this situation.
Yeah.
And MMT's description, I have actually gone through. You asked me to read Warren Musler's Seven Deadly Innocent Frauds of Economic Policy, and then I've also read on my own Ray and Bell Keaton and also some MMT adjacent people such as Steve Keenan, Marvin Minsky, who are close-ish to MMT, but disagree on the bond assertion issue. But anyway, one of the things that I find interesting about that is all of the examples of the creation of currency involve, they do not necessarily all involve what we would call a modern state, but they do all involve a power relationship.
That's right. Yeah.
And a power relationship that is dependent on a near monopoly or an actual monopoly on force, correct?
100%. Yep.
Yeah. And the currency is also, in classical economic terms, actually, I'm gonna betray my bias. In Marxist terms, it is a substitute of a kind of a series of transactions that ultimately relate back to relations.
Yes.
Yes. All right. And we also agree that the limit of an economy has nothing to do with currency. It has to do with what on classical economics, and we're not going to do any of classical economics because I think it's not worth even considering in a lot of ways. What classical economics calls wealth, as opposed to value. And I realize that this is a distinction between MMT and Marxism, but that wealth is what we're actually at hand. Wealth is the physical commodities, actually not even physical commodities, the physical things that we can use, the holdings of relations that can produce those things. That's also part of wealth, like when the technologies that make it, and skills and general intellect that make us able to produce more and more things is a big part of wealth. So there is a power imbalance represented in most monetary systems, correct?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, yes, there is. And those are political questions. And we have to ask ourselves, what are some of the intrinsic or inherent things in capitalism that encourage those power relations that are so inequitable? I think that's an important question. I think it's one that Marx is very valuable for understanding, no doubt.
So, and we also agree that the list, I've seen the list of truly economic sovereign countries be as much as 20, but as little as 4, depending on who you're talking to, because of some of these relationships. There's a couple of questions that emerged from me that when I started looking into these economically sovereign countries, that does trouble me a little bit. One, we have already agreed that countries like Japan are economically sovereign.
Yes.
All those countries, however, are in what you would call, the core, or at least are tangential to the core economies. We all agree with that too?
When you say core economies, you're saying the major economies of the world, right?
I'm saying that the major economies of the world that have developed production and can produce commodities, goods, real goods.
With the exception of those on the euro. So with the exception of the countries in the Eurozone, I would say, yes, the monetarily sovereign criteria applies currently to the most developed countries in the world. The richest countries in the world are able to, they are operating on the principles that MMT describes, correct?
Correct. So I'm just going to bring up a case study that was popular to talk about, I don't know, when Syriza was coming to power in Greece. And,
great.
And I got into a debate with Steve King, who again is not an MMTer, and actually I think some of MMT's positions might be slightly more coherent than some of what he said. What I don't know from that exchange was if, for example, Greece was to leave the Eurozone, could it actually truly have established economic sovereignty?
Yeah,
And
great question. Yeah, sorry, go on. I didn't mean to cut you off.
So, and there's a couple of reasons why, and it has to do not with the currency question, but with the question of real material power in such a small country that is resource bound, and its traditional commodity production would be related to things that are not as valuable in the modern economy. And they could shift, of course, but.
Yeah, great. So couple things. As you pointed out, in terms of the currency, no problem, right? So it'd be able to, Greece, if it left the euro, would be able to issue its own currency. It would be able to tax in its own currency. And it wouldn't be taxing its population in any currency other than its own. And it would have a floating currency, right? The drachma. Mm. And in order to meet that criteria, they would have to have a developed enough economy to do so. Before the sovereign debt crisis in the Eurozone that the Eurozone created, okay, by virtue of bad policy, by bad treaties, imposing unnecessary restrictions on Eurozone members, Greece had exactly that. And they've now been forced to sell off a lot of their public utilities, nationalized ports, etc., to foreign owners. So I don't think that they certainly would not be as developed necessarily or have as much policy flexibility if they went to the drachma tomorrow as they did before the advent of the euro. That being said, they would still be a fully monetarily sovereign nation. The problem that arises, the challenge that they would face if they dropped the euro would be a political one. I think there would be a lot of reprisal, there would be a lot of retribution from other Eurozone states, including Germany, possibly some of the other Central and North American Eurozone states, for having abandoned the monetary union. And again, that would be strictly because of political control. The idea that we're going to subjugate this to our will and to what benefits us under the current rules of the Troika, which is the IMF, the Eurogroup, European Commission, and the European Central Bank. So I think that there would definitely be some retribution politically for that, because they don't want to change instead of changing the rules, instead of understanding how they could become a more monetarily sovereign union, they are stuck in a way of thinking in which they are entrenched, right? So they've accepted the monetarist revolution, the neoliberal model of austerity, which is exactly backwards. So what's been imposed on Greece is when they've fallen on recessionary times, what do they get? What's imposed on them by the Troika, right? It's austerity. It's increased taxes and reduced spending. They're forced to reduce their spending and increase taxes in order to get the euros that they need to continue running their government. This is exactly backwards. When you're in a business cycle downturn, you want to, what? Decrease taxes and increase government spending. So this is a result of poor understanding and entrenched political and economic thought that is really devastating and gets the entire paradigm backwards.
I agree with most of your assertions, but maybe not the motivational core of yours why you're describing those assertions. So let me get into that for a second. You attend that this is mostly a political problem and about reprisal, correct? And I would agree. I would agree that there would have been reprisal. However, we've already talked about MMT admitting that the real limit to an economy is its material goods and services, and that can be limited by political decisions such as labor arbitrage, unfair currency, different ways, unfair currency limitations, negative regulation. There's a couple things about that I find interesting, but I do not know that if Greece immediately had internal, there's no difference between internal and external economic sovereignty, according to MMT. If it had economic sovereignty by the four standards by MMT, it floated as currency. the floating currency over in the international trade, even without reprisal,
Mhm.
they would have to trade with a larger power that had more productive capacity, either China, the EU as a whole, or the US, probably, maybe Australia. It would be very hard to find a block that doesn't have people with more productive capacity and more currency sovereignty to trade with. Are we correct on that? Like, it would be hard for them.
Yeah, so I mean, it's a good question. So a floating currency is one that is traded on the Forex markets. And one of the things that MMT has noticed is that, well, let me step back for a second. What makes the value of a currency that's floating go up or down, right, on the Forex markets? It's the same as with the stock market. It's bids and asks, right? So it's demand for it on the Forex market makes the value go up. Purchase orders essentially, and sell orders if sell orders exceed purchase orders, it makes the value go down. But what MMT has noticed is that there is no correlation between what a currency is doing on the Forex markets and inflationary pressure. These are not coupled. So whether or not you can expect to see inflation in an economy that's fully monetarily sovereign has nothing to do with the demand for that currency on Forex markets. So the question would be, would people be willing to invest in Greece? Would the Greek economy be able to invest in itself? Do they have the raw material and resources necessary to build up their infrastructure? Greece is not a third world country. It's not a developing nation. So they already have much of that infrastructure. Unfortunately, a lot of it has been sold off because of the constraints imposed by the Eurozone, and the Maastricht Treaty have been sold off to the Chinese, control a lot of these ports. I'm sure that German private equity firms have bought up a lot of this debt and now control what used to be under state control by the Greek government. So those are all a problem, okay? But they're not problems that can't be overcome. Greece can get the raw material it needs from other member states. It's just going to require international cooperation.
And what would encourage such international cooperation, since the international, we can already see that the adoption of, say, a seemingly maladaptive ideology by a certain group has put Greece at a distinct disadvantage. In fact, it would, even though it is clearly not a developing nation, that it has been treated as if it is a periphery economy, sucking resources out, selling them off to. So, like, what would the incentive internationally be to do that?
Yeah. So again, I think it's going to depend on political arrangements, right? The immediate consequence, I think, would be punitive, right? Or what we referred to earlier as reprisal. It's like, how dare you break from the model that we all agreed to back in 1992 or 93 when the Maastricht Treaty was signed. So you're saying, what is the incentive for countries to give Greece the resources that they might need to develop, right? Well, trade is a big one. Okay, well, Greece does have things to export, and they certainly do have things that attract foreign capital, including tourism, and that's not a small part of the Greek economy. Greece also has a manufacturing sector that would need to be built up. The question is, what incentive would, say, the Germans have for giving primary manufacturing goods to the Greeks, who have now, abandoned that regime, the Euro regime? And that's a very difficult question. That's a very serious challenge. The solution, or at least the transitional solution that former finance minister Yanis Varoufakis gave for this problem when he was finance minister of Greece, he's now a member of parliament under a new party, a sort of post-Syriza party, or alternative to Syriza, essentially, party, was to create a parallel payment system, something that would temporarily function like a Bitcoin until the Greek economy could stabilize. And that is not a sustainable long-term solution. Bitcoin at best is digital gold. So that is not necessarily something that is going to hold up for the long term. They would have to peg their currency to it. They would have to operate in such a way where there are all these digital transactions paying for goods and services. And and they would still be forced to import a lot of goods. But it would also create a lot of new imaginative space inside Greece for worker co-ops, worker democracy, re-examining how surplus value is distributed. Greece has a serious problem, as do most well-developed capitalist nations at this point, with wealth inequality and most of the capital being concentrated in very few hands at the top of the socioeconomic arc.
Okay, so I will accept. I find your explanation plausible and fair. So one of the things, though, I pushed back on Steve King when I had this debate about the same thing, is that the incentives in the international market, as we agree, and the incentives between states, would probably lead to a very immediate set of problems for Greece, and the answers that have been given seem suboptimal at best.
Yes.
I find that this is true for almost every economy outside of the developed world, and the core economies, as we say in world systems theory. I can give an example from my personal life. I was in Egypt when a mixture of IMF and Chinese pressure had it tried to float its own currency.
Yep.
And in doing so, it immediately had hyperinflation, and it immediately had a problem with reserves. And so, the reasons for that are not because that the way neoliberals would probably tell you that that they were over profligate or whatever. The reasons for that are that they are forced to buy their goods they don't have enough of their own goods, and no country does. No country in the world exists, even in the United States, under truly autarkic conditions. Like they have to get some of the materials of their material production from somewhere else.
Right.
And I respect the fact that MMT is not normative except in the jobs claim, but I fear that when I look at the same conditions you do, and I accept almost all the premises, except maybe some of the power relationships, and we'll get into that, that I don't really see a way for developing economies to take advantage of this. And I also do not see the incentives for developed economies to ever let them.
Great.
Because of things like, not because of currency capture, but because of like wealth capture, labor arbitrage,
yep.
Relations of power between states, etc.
Yep. So that's a really significant and important challenge that you raise, and it's one that I've spent a lot of time thinking through and working on, actually. And Professor Fadel Kaboub has probably done the best work on this, how it is that developing nations can transition their economies in such a way that the principles that MMT describes and the insights it offers will be the ones that those economies that can now describe the way those economies are operating instead of the way they're currently operating.
Right.
Couple of things here that would be essential, right? So one is giving up this notion of imposition by the IMF and World Bank that says you have to pursue your comparative advantage. So if you're Jamaica, sell bananas and do that, and don't worry about developing, getting the raw material to develop your own infrastructure. In the Middle East, we think of, there are countries like Iran, for example, which we think of as very oil rich, and they are oil rich. The problem is they don't have any refineries.
Right.
So they have to export the oil to get it refined and then re-import it for their own population. These are major problems. And you're right, there's a power relation imbalance that causes this. So how do we overcome it? One of the ways, and there's actually good evidence for this very recently, is through fear, frankly. The IMF and World Bank are now talking about in the last 2 weeks, hey, we're seriously considering all third world developing nation debt. It's like, oh, really? Where did that come from? Well, one is they're realizing that this, like the monetarist revolution is over, and it was never true to begin with, that it was based on faulty claims. and that the COVID crisis throughout the world has brought those realities to bear, that this is not actually how economies operate in terms of their fiscal and monetary processes, but that what MMT describes is actually accurate. So they're talking about debt forgiveness. Now, why? Well, because they're afraid of a lot of things. Mass migration, right?
Mm-hmm.
War, civil strife, immigration, terrorism, you name it. So now they're looking very seriously at debt relief. They realize it's both economically feasible and they're afraid of losing power. So those two things combined, the elites that run these organizations are concerned for what it does to preserve their own statuses. There's no doubt about it. And for what it might mean for their own countries vis-a-vis these people having to flee their homes because they're unable to develop their economies because they owe so much money to this and that country in euros or dollars, as you mentioned before. So those are real challenges. And this is going to require, like, as what you're really suggesting is just like, what is the incentive for these countries to do that? I mean, we're talking about a lot of former colonies of Western imperialist nations.
Mm-hmm.
Which are happy in many ways to keep their thumb on these countries and continue to exploit the cheap labor of these countries and prevent them from having monetary sovereignty. This is a serious political problem, and it's an important challenge, and it needs to be addressed in that way. The thing to keep in mind is it's not an economic problem. It is an economic choice as a result of these political coercive imbalances that you described.
As I will assert my Marxism here a little bit. I don't know
Sure.
that there is a difference between economic and political problems, but and in any field of anything. But that aside, I find this power relationship that we have here interesting in the case of MMT. It is definitely true in the United States, unquestionably, that we could be doing tons more public spending, even if you don't accept MMT. Let's just say you're just a regular old Nancy-pansy, old-fashioned Keynesian.
Yeah.
That we see that there is that inflation is not particularly going up. That that there is no reason why we couldn't, without even risk to fairly traditional models of the economy, where we could not spend a lot more. The deficit, I mean, we all know that in power, no one actually really cares. Right? Weirdly, actually, the only people who kind of care are Democrats, but when they're actually in power. But, Republicans, for as much as they talk about it, they don't care. Which is about what I find MMT bracketing out. And maybe this is a point of disagreement between us, and maybe it's actually a point where your MMT sees its limits. I don't know, because MMT, again, we're accepting that, except for the full jobs guarantee, is not normative. It just describes things as they are in capitalism. Now,
Right.
the debate here is really, what implications does this have for post capitalism? And to get into that, we need to get into some other definitions that we haven't gone into. The first is, we keep on talking about currency as if everybody knows what it is, and I want to spell out the difference. What the standard view of currency is three functions, and then the difference in neo-chartalism, and specifically neo-chartalism is not true of classical chartalism, so I'm not going to bring that up. So we have, money is a store of value.
Yep.
Money is a
Promise to pay, an
a
IOU.
promise to pay, an IOU, and money is a medium exchange, except that, classically speaking, neo-chartalism, which takes its keys here, I believe, from Alfred Mitchell Inez, right?
Yep.
That the medium of exchange is a misunderstanding of
That's right.
the standard deferred payment.
Correct. That's absolutely right. Yeah, because when you're talking about medium of exchange, you're back to the idea of a substitute for barter, a simple way to sort of lubricate exchange so that instead of trading you bananas for chickens, I have these seashells that represent the thing that I am now trading that has a certain value connected to chickens and bananas. And that's the Robinson Crusoe story
Right.
of how money came into existence. And from archaeological records going back 5,000 years, all of the evidence is in exactly the opposite direction, that money came about always, including in pre-state civilizations, as a result of a central authority imposing it as a fine or a tax. Yeah.
Right. And so you had something representing the extraction of things in kind, usually, and that is the beginning of currency. That was debt, and credit also, so that you could get things in kind for that script. It was, and it was done by some kind of central authority, not necessarily a modern state. We completely agree on that. It's actually one of my bugaboos with Marxist is the assumption, just because it is assumed in the Critique of Capital that is necessarily true for the Robinson Crusoe model. There's very little, there's almost no evidence for it. The only examples we have of barter from anthropology are between groups, not within them in early society. So again, no contest from me here. But I went through both Mosler and Ray's examples of how this was established, and every single one of them are imperial, and they're about forcing people into a labor circuit.
Oh, it's absolutely coercive. I mean, you may have heard Warren Mosler's example of have you heard this one where, the metaphor that he gives is, I've got a bunch of people in a room and I need somebody to clean the floor. And I say, okay, who wants my business card? Have you heard this one?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. So for the sake of the audience, I'll do it. Anybody can create money, right? Anybody can create money, and currency is just the state's money. That's what it is. So there's money, and then what we call currency is the state's version of money. So anything that's state money, we call currency, okay? So anybody can, you and I can create Derricks and, Kangarloos. We can go to our printer and print them out. The trick is in getting it accepted. And the getting accepted part is arguably very coercive, which is what you're referring to. Okay, so the metaphor that Warren Mosler likes to give, and I'll do it. I'll do what he does. He says, okay, we're in a room. There's a bunch of people. I want someone to clean the floor, and in exchange, I'll give you my business card. So he holds up his business card and says, if you clean the floor before this meeting is over, I'll give you my business card. Who wants one of my business cards? And of course, nobody wants his business card. It's worthless, right? And then he says, you can't leave the room without one of my business cards. And if you try, I've got my guy at the door, the bouncer, who with a 9mm. Okay, what have you done? You've literally just created unemployment. Everybody in that room is now unemployed and is going to be fighting over those business cards, right? And in order to get them, they have to provide a good or service to you. Now, what do you as the business card holder represent? You're the issuing authority. You're the central authority issuing the business cards. You're the government in this case. The guy at the door with the 9mm, that's the tax man. Okay, and everybody in that room who now needs your business cards is the private sector, right? Is the population, and you have to provision yourself. Now, so yes, one can say that that's okay, inherently coercive. But here's the thing: by virtue of having a government in the first place, okay, we expect something from that government. And in order for the government to provide whatever it is we expect from them, they need to employ the population, what in econ speak is called provision itself. They need people to build the roads and bridges that you expect them to build, or to provide for the common defense by funding a military, by getting people to join the army, etc. And so that's where it comes in, is that the imposition of the tax is what creates demand for the currency, right? We can't pay for our groceries and chickens because your grocery store can't use those chickens to pay its taxes, you know? And the same thing goes with households on the individual level. So you're right, there's definitely a coercive element there. And the question is, to what degree, or can that be diminished or eliminated altogether by expanding democratic principles and expanding democracy? What if the people were the government? Then would it still be coercive?
That's a fair question, but I have some more questions along that line. When we actually look at this and we go back to our Greece example, we look at the example of what happened in Egypt. We talk about how China has avoided this by basically accepting a certain amount of it's deliberately undervalued its currency,
devalued,
devalued its currency to, and I'll use scare marks because I realize that this is sort of a ridiculous claim, but to effectively to be able to get U.S. currency to buy materials that it needs, not just from the U.S. but from all over the world because of the U.S. hegemony in the market. And I thought about this, and I also think one of the things that is interesting about MMT and the core of monetary sovereignty is it is also tied somewhat directly, really, to military sovereignty.
Yeah, that's right. You have to conscript. That's correct, because conscription and having a standing army, if nothing else, that is what the government will have to to provision itself, right? Is human labor, human bodies. And if you have a regime anthropologically, like, I'm sure there were times in ancient Rome and ancient Greece where there was a dearth of public services being provided by the central authority, but they still had an army. And that army needs conscripts, and that's how they got the money accepted, is by saying, okay, look, there's this tax that I'm going to impose. In order for you to pay it, you're going to have to do work for us. The job that we need done right now is going to conquer our neighbors. Yes.
Right. Yeah.
You're absolutely right. Yeah.
And so what I find interesting about chartalism, and I'll give you my other bias now. I'm talking about classical chartalism here. Was its relationship to Marxism in the initial instantiation one that I actually find very underexplored? And the reason why I find it underexplored is it actually was a tension within the early Marxist group. It was a tension between Marx and Ferdinand Lassalle. Now, maybe you're getting to where I'm going with my concerns about MMT too, but let's get to the story about Lassalle. Lassalle was a jurist and was the founder of what would become the SPD in Germany. He took a bunch of illegal anarchist, socialist, communist, Marxist groups, mostly in the form of unions, had them form a political alliance. That political alliance developed into a parliamentary party. Lassalle drafted the Goethe program, which Marx most famously critiqued. But their biggest fight actually was probably not that. It was about the relationship to the German state. And it was a major issue because Lassalle thought, as a jurist, that the law was above class and that it was neutral.
Okay. Yep.
And he also, at the same time, because he was a contemporary of Knapp, adopted the view that the Chartist view that money was a function of law. One that, as far as because state money, fiat currency, is a function of law. There's no
Absolutely.
This is objectively true.
Yeah.
This led Ferdinand Lassalle, though, to try to make deals with Bismarck. In fact, the full extent of this was not known until after his death, when his private letters to Bismarck, and at one point he was literally trying to suppress democracy in the country because he thought it was too bourgeois. This thus infuriating Marx, and while Marx did cry at his funeral, he would not let people associated with the First International fully join the SPD until Lassalle was dead. And it had to do with empowering the German state. And what is one of the first things Bismarck did with some of that power was the anti-socialist laws.
Yep.
Now, one of the things that I find interesting about MMT is I think its description is absolutely correct. I think its description of the way currency in the modern world absolutely correct. It does bracket out some commodity stuff, but it's indirectly in because of the formal nature of currency after 1930. And that it's fairly honest about the power relationships of this, but it then takes these power relationships and says that we can end, well, let me say, not MMT, certain MMTers who think that there are pretty good policy implications to this can take this function of coercion, which is this hidden relationship of coercion and currency, and use it to provide all these things to the economy. And it is, again, I agree with you, it is a political problem because the separation of political and economics is fake anyway. But but my concern is I don't know what evidence you have that they would ever allow that.
Yep. And that's one of my main challenges to MMT is that, I say, look, what we're describing to take full advantage of what we're describing, we need a very different incarnation of our political legislative bodies, for example, right? And that's just the tip of the iceberg, is if you want to really take advantage of what MMT describes in an economy, you have to have a very nimble Congress. If your political persuasion is more on the left, now you need a Congress or a parliament that is very left oriented in order to get those policy implications that use MMT or that take advantage of MMT's insights. And so this is a real problem, right? And like, you have to overhaul the budgeting process in the United States in order to make fiscal adjustments on the fly. So how do you do all this, right? So, I mean, one mean is to simply say, okay, look, the more people understand this, the more pressure that they're going to apply on the political system. They're no longer going to tolerate the how you're going to pay for that question, because now they know that that's a ruse and it's the wrong question and they have the right answer to it. So that's one avenue. But we both know that like political power is not going to simply concede its political power in favor of policies that may benefit the masses, but may not necessarily benefit like the private equity firms that are happy to see an economy that relies on credit and may have policymakers and lawmakers in their pocket. So it's true that like you have to have reform and political reform. And that's why when Bernie Sanders was talking about a political revolution, these were the kinds of things that he was saying, is we have to overhaul the way that we operate within these institutions to make the institutions more democratic. And we can talk also about, extricating ourselves from capitalism versus trying to seize institutional power to make that change. I'm sure, we're going to be on opposite sides of that coin. But I do see some real possibility just based on
this is the important part.
I do. I'm still here. Okay, I'm still here. So I do see, like I was saying, I do see some possibilities right now as a result of COVID for things like a general strike to get these demands met. So the general strike, these demands are made, the pressure is applied to the system, they come back at us with how you're going to pay for that. And we say, actually, we know exactly how we're going to pay for that. We're going to pay for that the way we've been paying for it for almost 100 years now. Now, is that the solution to capitalism? Absolutely not. Is that the solution to all of the ills that capitalism spurs? Of course not. But it does widen our imaginative horizons for creating more democratic social arrangements, giving people more resources, allowing for more time. And there is actually, I should not be offering strategy to Marxists here. I might come to regret it someday. But if I was arguing for MMT from a Marxist perspective, and I think this is actually one of the reasons why we had a number of Marxists show up at the annual MMT conference at Stony Brook University last year, quite a number, actually. I was surprised. Is because the federal jobs guarantee, one of the things that I hear from so many Marxists is, you know, technology is going to displace labor, and then there will be a falling rate of profit that ends up at zero, and we'll have all of these machines making all of these things that nobody can buy, and that'll lead to collapse. One of the many ways in which Marxists argue, including Ted Reese, who I argued on this program last time, argues will lead to collapse. And this is simply an unnecessary. It's a dubious fear. It's a very dubious fear. But if I was strategizing for Marxists via MMT, I'd say, look, let's say it's legitimate and it's happened, right? That it happens. All right. Now you have a federal jobs guarantee that's employing a massive percentage of the population. There's your labor army right there.
Oh, fair enough. However, there's a couple issues with the jobs guarantee that always fascinated me. Okay, and it's because, and again, it has to do with power relations, not the instruments of which MMT is talking about, and also what those power relations are really about, which is the accumulation of wealth. No one actually cares about currency. Well, okay, they do, but in so much that they do, they care about what currency can buy or what power it can hold them.
Exactly.
Right. So, but let's talk about the jobs guarantee. Sure. So, I'm going to take Kelton's model, Stephanie Bell Kelton's model, and
Stephanie Kelton,
yeah, Kelton, because I think it's a little, it was a little bit more cut and dry than the version that was in Moore Mosler's book, but we could talk about both. So if Kelton just says, well, we have a blanket minimum, like service core or jobs guarantee, and it's going to be, I think Mosler proposed it at like $8, but that was a long time ago. It would be higher than that now. And that would be good, right? And it would be good for a variety of reasons. You have an army of labor.
That's how I think it would be good for Marxists.
Yeah, it'd be good for
if their worst fears come to fruition about, dear God, the robots are coming. But yeah, go on.
Yeah, well, for one, I think the Grossman interpretation of crisis is actually contested within even that brand of Marxism. And two, although I think there's some validity to it if you're stuck on commodity money. And two, which we're not. And two, the other thing that I think there's another interpretation of Marxism is this crisis actually regenerates capital every time, that it actually, through undervaluation and sometimes the literal destruction of capital, that the overproduction problem it's fixed. And when that doesn't happen, there's generally war, but like, okay, fine. But the labor guarantee. Okay, so let's get into that. Would the government be able to fire? Would the government be able to fire workers for something? Let's say they come into the job drunk.
Yep.
Okay, so they would, but they would be promised a job somewhere else, right? Because we still would need full employment for this to have the effect that it would need to have.
It's a transitional. The federal jobs guarantee is a transitional job, right?
Okay.
So even though it is public sector work, it sits separately from regular public sector work. It is work that is available to anyone and everyone who wants a job. And the idea is to transition from that job to a private or public sector job. And that this transition is facilitated by the federal jobs guarantee because during business cycle upticks, there is an increase in demand for labor. And the private as well as the regular public sector have to get that labor from somewhere. And they, as we all know, or should know, they all prefer to get it from those who are currently employed or have a recent work history than those who have been long-term unemployed and have had their skills go into decline or haven't kept up on new skills that might be relevant to the work in which they're doing.
Right. So why would a business class, other than maybe popular appeal, and by popular appeal I actually literally mean counterforce. Counterforce does not necessarily have to be an insurrection, but it's got to be force. Why would they ever allow that? Because
it's great for them. They would absolutely love it. I mean, MMT is actually, it's fantastic for business because it increases aggregate demand. Capitalism runs on sales. So it's, if nothing else, in terms of what it does for profit margins, it's great for business. Now, the thing is, it's not great for the private equity firms because they're relying on credit, right? They're relying on an economy that is in deficit, that is having to dip into its savings. So look at in the 90s when Bill Clinton, under the Clinton economy, we were running budget surpluses, okay? When we were running budget surpluses in the United States during the Clinton years, the economy was in deficit because the government's surplus is the private sector's deficit to the penny and vice versa. So what that meant was, okay, as we were paying down the national debt during the Clinton years, that was forcing people to rely on more and more bank credit, more and more leverage. And then what did you get at the end of that period? You got the dot-com bust, okay, which was being held up, that bubble was being held up by credit money, not high-powered money. High-powered money is Federal Reserve money that's injected into the economy. Credit money is the money that's created by commercial banks when they make loans. So why would the business sector go for it? They would go for it because it doesn't cost them anything, and they have a more reliable labor force from which to rely and to hire and to promote from the federal jobs guarantee into a similar or elevated role, either in a private firm or in the regular public sector itself, that pays more money than what the federal jobs guarantee would pay. The number that's been floated and widely accepted under current economic conditions as we're sitting here today is $15 an hour for a federal jobs guarantee job.
Right, which is a similar thing to the current push by most progressives for a $15 an hour minimum wage. All right, which was not actually a living wage, and that's part of the point.
I agree with that, by the way. I mean, cost of living is different. New York versus Montana is a big difference. And yet, because of the price anchor mechanism of the federal jobs guarantee, you cannot have a change in that price between cost of living. This is where something like a supplemental progressive basic dividend or progressive supplemental dividend could come into play. We can talk about that later. Yanis Varoufakis, who I mentioned earlier, has proposed what I think is an excellent solution to that problem.
So the issue that I would, of course, take with this is that it seems to alleviate class conflict automatically.
To alleviate
just remove because you just told me that if it would actually be good for most of the sectors in business, not the finance sector, which would be devastated, to have a well-trained workforce, which they don't have to train. They have now offsided that out to the government that has purchasing power because now they have money, and that's good. So it, in some ways, this model that you have spelled out to me is a fiscal policy kind of Fordism, with the state acting as the broker, instead of, say, just the firm itself. Now, the other thing that I'm interested in is we've been establishing this entire time, the real limit to the economy is wealth and skills, and that what people want is also wealth and skills. Like, people care about currency because of the power it gives them and because of the access it gives them to material things. I have a hard time with this idea that business, that it could be both good for business and good for the workers in the long run. I have no problem with it in the immediate run. And in fact, I have often said that in in immediate policies, I would not oppose anything any MMT or a post-Keynesian suggests if it was alleviating for the working class. I don't believe weird theories like we should bait and switch them and make things worse so they get radical and rebel. I can't think of anything more bad faith and inhumane than that kind of crap. But so I want to take that off the table immediately.
Sure.
But yeah, go ahead.
Yep. Sure. Yeah. So by taking advantage of MMT's insights, okay, that means we get to spend money into the economy. We have more policy space. Policy space becomes more flexible. Who gets that added wealth in the economy is a political decision, right? So if you are Mitch McConnell, what you're going to do to take advantage of MMT is do exactly what Reagan did to take advantage of what MMT describes, and what Trump did to take advantage of what MMT describes, which you are going to cut taxes on the rich. You're going to cut taxes on the 1%. That's not the way it has to go. In conjunction, regulation, as Derick mentioned earlier, is very integral to taking full advantage of MMT. If you want to avoid monopoly power, if you want to break monopolies, if you want to give opportunity, and I really want to get into this too, is like workplace democracy, you can do that. So there is nothing inherent in MMT that says all of the gains added to an economy have to go to the top. There's nothing inherent or innate in it.
Right. So,
to suggest that.
Sure. So what I would say to that is MMT in and of itself seems to, because it is a descriptive paradigm describing capitalism as it is now, is class and state theory neutral, even though it is dependent on both in some ways, which is both a virtue of it being empirical and a problem when you're dealing with politics, because it doesn't, as you've admitted, it might give you some wedges, and we disagree on exactly what that would imply, how different sections of the class would play out. And I want to talk about what you just said about MMTs. I want to give an example of what we're seeing right now. Weirdly, there are wackadoo conservatives who will say that it's Trump's policies on immigration. There are people who will say that it's just, like me, that it was a natural state of the business cycle. We did see improvements in the economy across the board at the end of this last business cycle, and then for once an exogenous, not an endogenous shock, accelerated the downward turn that was probably beginning to happen. Anyway, we then saw a ton of quantitative easing. I realize that MMT is not quantitative easing. It requires tax policy, and that cannot just be done by the Fed in our current governmental model. Right. And but that quantitative easing did something very interesting. And you talked about sectional inflation. And I think I just noticed that sectoral inflation, right? Yeah. I noticed that during this time period that quantitative easing went into, you had the hypervaluation of paper assets. And you also saw, and people misinterpret this, people think this is a transfer of wealth from the bottom to the top, and what this actually is a capturing of assets and the destruction of wealth at the bottom. It's not going to the top. It's just, it's literally just not flowing. That velocity is not getting out there.
Exactly. Yeah, that's right. Yeah, it's the padding of corporate balance sheets by the federal government. Yeah.
Right, and it works the way MMT would describe. So, as a political choice in the current thing in the United States, we see that any MMT policy that's likely to be implemented, not by someone like Bernie Sanders, and we've also seen the current party system, being that they're bourgeois parties, make sure that Bernie Sanders only got so far.
Right.
And whether whether legitimately, illegitimately is not my place to say, but whatever. There's a hard limit to that. I don't see how MMT by itself would really do that much for us. However, I can see how understanding the way that it changes the way that it changes power relationships is super important for us to do anything going forward. But I am not sure that the current policy proposals made by MMTers go anywhere near enough. And I think they seem to be popular in the press because they do give us a leverage, and I think that's real. But they also kind of they seem to make this, at least in the short run, where the upper classes don't really have to pay anything for this to happen. And
That's right. They don't. Like, they literally, I don't need Jeff Bezos or Mark Zuckerberg or anybody who's a billion or Elon Musk's money in order to finance government spending. Now, that doesn't mean that if I'm so politically, or, that if my political orientation is such that I shouldn't tax them. It doesn't mean that we shouldn't have a wealth tax. It doesn't mean that there shouldn't be an estate tax. It doesn't mean that I shouldn't take those measures to narrow the gap between rich and poor. It simply identifies the real reasons by which we tax, right? So we tax for the social engineering purposes that I just described. We tax to mitigate inflation, okay? Because when we tax, we're deleting money from the economy. That's less money that people have to spend, all right? And we tax to create, as we discussed earlier, a demand for the currency itself.
Right, but states need physical things, right? We agree with this, correct? Mm-hmm. And what we're saying is the taxation is not to extract those physical things, but to compel them. But effectively, it is a way to capture them. Now, to my knowledge, even if MMT is true, you would almost have to change everything about the currently existing state for it to be politically viable.
I think it depends. I think it will. Let's remember that we're talking about pre-existing arrangements in the economy, right? So what you're saying, just to be clear, is that to fully take advantage of it in a way that would give us, in the case of the United States, single-payer health care, Green New Deal, living wage, federal jobs guarantee, a whole host of progressive, socially democratic policies and programs, we would have to take advantage of it to a degree that we're not currently taking advantage of what it describes, and that we can't get there because of these political impediments as a result of power relations, where we have political power essentially serving capital instead of capital serving political power. One of the implications for MMT is that we can change that arrangement, right? And so if you look at countries that I would argue currently, the US has democratic institutions, they just don't function democratically, right? So if we look at countries that are also doing this, like Japan is a really good example of what I'm driving at here. Japan, for decades now, has had no inflation. They currently have zero GDP growth, okay? And the whole thing, they have a 250% debt to GDP ratio, but they're a monetary sovereign and everything works just fine, okay? Now, when I say everything works just fine, I'm not saying that people don't have work-life alienation and existential alienation and interpersonal alienation as a result of capitalism, which still exists in that country, despite the fact that they don't have GDP growth. They have, all of the things that I described, because they still have surplus value and they still have private property, right? So I'm not saying it eliminates those things. When I say it works just fine, I'm saying they don't have these massive economic crises that we face in the United States. They've been able to mitigate business cycle downturns. They don't have to pursue GDP growth because they realize how their economy actually works. And we can do that too. In fact, I would argue that reducing GDP growth right now and having a zero growth rate policy may actually be, well, not right now while we're facing COVID and businesses aren't operating, but under normal conditions would actually be essential to help stave off some of the worst possible consequences of climate change.
Okay. I would agree with a lot of what you're saying, with one interesting caveat about Japan. And we've talked about the power relations hidden in this, and we've talked about Japan. I mean, we could talk about Japan's actually very unique history in that regard, as part of the geostrategic plan of the United States. But one of the things I noticed about Japan is Japan also, I hate to use the term hedges its bets, but hedges its bets in some ways, because one of the things Japan also has as part of its debt load, doesn't care about its debt to GDP ratio. It doesn't care about growing its GDP. You're completely correct, but it does seem to care about being able to trade, and it seems to hedge its bets against the United States in some ways by having gold reserves. Now that doesn't question anything that you said about the actual internal workings of MMT. It does not. I am not throwing that into doubt. It makes me wonder about all the power relations that are in play, which are probably larger than any one nation can decide, even the United States.
Yeah, and we just have to, like, for clarity, point out too. Well, I mean, that suggests, let's be clear, right? I mean, MMT is not an America first. The implications for taking full advantage of what MMT describes are not an America first orientation. And the gold reserves that you're talking about in Japan, whatever they may be, their currency is not fixed to those gold reserves.
Absolutely not. You're correct. Like, they're absolutely not fixed to those gold reserves. Those gold reserves are separate, and they seem to be for a different function. And so, like I said, it is not a critique of any of the objective conditions that MMT is describing in the way fiat currency works. It is not an objective critique of the way it describes Japan's working. It just makes me have some doubts, because I don't know many MMTers. Maybe there are some. I think maybe Steve Bannon, right, for the MMT on off days or something. But there's an evil version of everything.
Yeah.
But I don't think most MMTers believe or think that MMT is necessarily an American first policy. And I just wonder if, because of the objective conditions we are describing come out of a certain set of power relations, there's no way for it to somewhat not be. But again, we would have to be able to, frankly, compel these changes that are implied, are possible levers to no.
That's right.
And that has not been allowed to happen.
I'll tell you something that's been really encouraging to me, that I was, like, not entirely shocked, but let's say severely surprised to discover. About 2 weeks ago, Larry Summers, who many in the audience, and I'm sure yourself will know, is one of these neoliberal icons, to Yanis Varoufakis, former finance minister who I invoked earlier, who was in the Syriza government that you brought up, used to refer to as the Prince of Darkness. 2 weeks ago, he was on, like, Bloomberg Business or like CNBC or one of these, like, financial, like, networks, like mainstream US networks, saying that the monetarist revolution is over and that we realize that fiscal policy is the only way forward, and that the IMF is being seriously considering and being advised by people like himself and others like Dean Baker to forgive all developing world debt. So that's really interesting. Now, what I see there in Marxist terms is a window of opportunity that has opened, right? Where the sort of the critical factor is at a pressure point. And the question is whether or not we're going to realize what's happening and force our way through it, right? If we don't, again, in Marxist terms, the whole world is lost, right? So the subjective factor in all of this is, I think, at a near breaking point. What are we going to do about it? What are the ways in which we can decide we're going to make our own workplace arrangements? I agree with you that I don't think we can simply rely on elected officials, given like the political realities of a country, especially like the United States, to just understand this and then do it, because 90% of Washington is corrupt one way or another, whether it be normatively or literally in a financial sense. It's going to require masses of people to understand that they're essentially getting ripped off, and that they're not seeing the fruits of the collective labor and productivity that has been generated in the economy, and that our productive output could be more equitably distributed if we want to, and that it's not a matter of tax revenue. It's not a matter of finding the money to pay for it. We are not talking about MMT. MMT should never be called a policy. It is not a switch or something that you apply. And that's always important to keep in mind. It is, like you said, it's empirical. It's a description of how the economy actually operates.
All right. My response to that is that our fundamental disagreements are not about the description that MMT describes. It is about what it would take to fundamentally change the economy. If MMT is part of a transition to something else, it is like any other part of the capitalist economy, including the state itself, which you would need to have the leverage to control. And so by itself, it just gives you some, maybe, ways to do that. I tend to think that that because of the bracketing out of class relations and the nature of the state, that it does not necessarily give you a whole lot in and of itself, other than a few policy things that you could do to more equally change the battlefield, so to speak. And what I mean by that, so you talk about the jobs guarantee, which I just don't think is politically going to happen, barring either the general strike, which has not happened ever, or compelled force of some variety or another. And so I find the idea that we can just do this by even legislative fiat or by an executive plan to be more than naive. And my reasons for that have to do with class analysis, have to do with power analysis within the state, and have to do with the fact that what we're actually fighting over is the access to material wealth. And I think some of the initial conditions of MMT as described in some of these policies seem kind of have your cake and eat it too, and they would still lead to, they would probably lead to a more humane capitalism, and maybe a more humane capitalism would create the space to get out. But historically speaking, we have not yet seen that, because if it had happened anywhere on Earth, we would know. So in some ways, we're debating a counterfactual for both of us, and I would say that in the immediate future, that people should take some of MMT's policies seriously, but start really thinking about beyond the possibility of these policies happening and the suggestions, how you would actually manifest them. And lastly, maybe a little bit, the Prince of Darknesses of this world might be scared right now. The Prince of Darknesses have been scared before. I mean, we talked about FDR. We can talk about FDR as a hero, but FDR had 20 years of a labor movement and a very, very scary new state on the world stage to compel some actions that capitalists had resisted in worse depressions prior to the 1930s. And those levers also still required a whole lot of things that we haven't talked about. I mean, like including war.
Yep.
And so, you know, I sometimes think if we present MMT alone, and then talk about policies implied by MMT, because I agree with you, it is not a policy suggestion. It is a theory of the circuit of money. I was a theory of the circuit of fiat money in particular. I mean, we didn't talk about other kinds of money. That I just don't think it's going to be enough, and I don't think you're even saying it would be. Like, so that I'm not even sure that we totally disagree, but yeah, we might disagree on how we could compel this. But
yeah, absolutely. I think everything that you've just mentioned are important considerations, but they also have, MMT also has implications for the arrangements that would exist in an anarchist syndicalist society, in a Marxist arrangement, as well as the destinations that both those socialist ideologies seek to reach, which is communism, right? And I'm happy to do another debate at another date and time where we go over blueprints for how to get there. And if it's all right with both of you, I'm happy to leave it at that and go on to Q&A.
Yeah, it's okay with me.
All right.
Okay. I'm guessing that is Ted Reese. That's great. I love it. Hi, Ted. Okay.
Here we go. Ted says a post-monetary system come into effect.
When does socialism as opposed to what?
As a post-monetary, he's using the definition of socialism as a post-monetary system.
Okay. Yeah. So I completely reject the notion that you can't have socialism with currency or a monetary system, because any social unit of account is, as far as I'm concerned, a monetary system. By the same token, I don't think that you do necessarily need currency. Actually, you wouldn't have currency as such because you wouldn't have nation states, but certainly there would be some sort of issuing authority for a unit of exchange, whether it be a strictly social credit or some kind of money exchange that is democratically distributed or based on the syndicalist model that anarchists are currently using in places like Rojava.
I would say if I don't think capitalism can be MMT'd away. I don't even think most MMTers would even suggest that. Maybe I'm wrong about that, but even those who want to get beyond capitalism seem to see it at best as a transitionary point within capitalism, right? That's why we talk about post-capitalism as opposed to socialism or whatever. The other thing is we could get into the contentions of inter-Marxist debates about whether or not things like labor credits are actually money, and I actually weirdly would agree with Sam on the fact that they're still money. This is a debate I have in Marxist circles all the time. And if they are not money, I don't really know how they work. They're just ration tickets. So beyond that, I also think like thinking in terms of 19th century like chits is weird. Like anyway, you know, I think class conflict is where this comes down, and how you resolve that is an open question. And one of the things that I've been arguing with other Marxists about, who try to pull from the early 20th century model of Marxism, is that happened in wartime before nukes. And so, and why that is important could be debated at another time, and not subject to the criterion of this debate. But I don't necessarily think that that's going to be the greatest guide either. Yeah, that's my answer.
Let me just respond to that to make clear that I think that if we take advantage of what MMT describes, and by take advantage I mean for the left, that we can reach a post-capitalist arrangement, a post-capitalist world and post-capitalist societies. In addition, I would say that, or to give examples that would be fundamental to that, are the principle of one employee, one share, one vote. Moving in these directions will get us to a point where the return on capital is such that there might be, for example, a 100% dividend as a result of AI or robotics or what have you. But all of this requires public mission, right? It requires a society that has agreed to a certain set of outcomes that it would like to achieve. And for me as an anarchist, I think it's important to lead by example. So if this thing that I'm claiming would be better is in fact better, people will support it. The question then becomes, how do we demonstrate that to the political authority? Well, fundamentally, I don't think it's about appealing to them. It may be right now in our current, like, this is what needs to be done to alleviate as much suffering as possible. But I think much more important is direct action.
All right.
Right. So let's talk about this AI thing. First of all, I'm a big proponent of getting as much automation and AI into the system as possible. I would love to see people's work weeks reduced to 15 hours a week. I think it would change labor capital relations for the better, and that we would have more time to actually do the things that we have that give us a real sense of purpose, that help us to self-aggrandize. Okay, now this question about whether or not it's going to displace workers in a way where no one will be able to afford the goods and services that are being produced. Couple of points here. Yeah. Why? Okay, so I disagree. Machines, if you have an AI, if you have an Android that doesn't need to eat or sleep and works faster than a human being, by what tenets, by what metrics would you think that with increased efficiency they wouldn't be able to extract more surplus value? If you're strictly looking at surplus value as in terms of human labor, then you're missing the point about, you're missing the key bit about, okay, what is my investment capital in output? Okay, I have to buy a machine, and I'm buying a machine instead of purchasing labor. Okay, if that machine is cheaper than the labor, then why wouldn't my profit margins increase? That's fine. Are you interested in the products that they have? Are their products all the same? Are they serving the same region? Is there a public investment that says, hey, what we need is more widgets? And the government says, you know what? The private sector is unwilling to produce widgets. Therefore, we will invest in producing widgets. And that might mean setting up a worker cooperative or syndicate to do that. It might mean finding an entrepreneur who's willing to make widgets for the government. Or, and this is probably my least favored of the three, depending on the government in question, have the government itself produce those things and offer them to the public at cost, essentially at cost. So what I'm talking about here, Steve, is government as employer and investor of last resort. And when I say investor, I mean in land, labor, and capital.
All right.
I think I'll let you think we'll just
So what I will say in response to that is I when you get to the government acting to create widgets or whatever at cost, you are not extracting surplus value, and that's fine. And that's a simply that is simply not actually an extractive relation. Okay, that's also fair. But at that, and if Sam is right, then you can do that within capital, which I doubt. And that's where we're at. The question about the exact nature of the declining rates of profits and its relationship to machines also doesn't deal with what even Grossman called externalities to that trend. There are externalities that cut against that trend. One is that you can increase human efficiency. Another is there are different regional things you can deal with it by law. A lot of this in the modern capitalist market is actually handled by IP law, which actually does limit absolute competition.
Yep.
Which is another weird relationship of power and monopoly, but it does mitigate against some of these things that pure, and I think in a pure, and I'm putting quotes capitalist relation, logically on paper would immediately start drive down prices and thus profits and thus wages. And we could get into when I think that's happened in history before. I also think Sam and I would disagree about that, but that really wasn't wasn't what I was here to debate. I'm also not sure that the decline in the rates of profits, as understood here, is even totally dependent on machines. Any social technology could create such competition and such without mitigation. I think my issue with all this is just what do we think the state actually is, and who do we think it actually serves? And if Sam and I agree on anything, it's that we would have to capture by whatever means a whole lot of the apparatus of state to force this and to get rid of the state relation itself. How fast you would want to do that is open to debate, even amongst Marxists. But it does seem that one of the interesting things about anarchism with MMT characteristics is that there is a concession that some kind of mediating form would be necessary, as opposed to classic insurrectionary anarchism where we just abolish everything tomorrow and we deal with whatever that would entail, which I have no idea what abolishing all capitalist relations and all state relations and all power relationships at once would do. I suspect the anarcho-primitivists are actually right on what that means, but I just don't think that's good. So it's probably mean mass death. But we have to deal with the fact that I think what Sam is describing in MMT does eventually become a non-capitalist relations, and I can't see the ruling class being okay with it for very long. And really, what this is that Sam is right, that the problem of this is political, but what that are political in the sense of politics as power, all right. But what that actually means, we probably, and it has been implied but not stated, disagree on what we think would have to happen to make that work, and if we think such reformism would lead to it or lead to capitalist capture again and the restart of a different cycle is another open question. All right, and one that we might have to debate because there are tons. There's so much here we can get into. I didn't even get into stuff like the ideas, alternate explanations for the conditions MMT describes, such as outsourcing inflation and whatnot, which is something MMTers generally reject as an unfair criticism. So we would have to go into that and lay all that down. And so we don't have time to do that today.
May I just offer one sentence here before we sign off?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. For the left, taking advantage of MMT's description of how the economy works is not dependent, okay, on the system's constant need for surplus value to keep itself going. I'll leave it at that.
We learned a lot. We will move to, I don't know how much you see enough, but I'm going left to you again. But didn't really offer much at the end there. But okay. Come back with questions from me. All right. Thank you, guys. We'll end now.
Thank you.
Yeah.